Early today, according to initial reports, a rapid chain of events involving Venezuela triggered alerts across diplomatic channels and international newsrooms almost simultaneously. Within hours, official statements, emergency briefings, and sharply conflicting interpretations began circulating side by side. But the question that immediately took hold was not simply what had happened, it was why this moment had arrived now. Analysts following the region argue that the visible incident is only the surface of a much larger calculation, one that had been forming quietly for years and reached a point where waiting began to look more dangerous than acting. To understand why this moment feels different, it is necessary to look beyond today's headlines. Venezuela gradually slipped out of daily global focus without ever leaving strategic consideration. For much of the past decade, it was framed primarily as an economic collapse and a humanitarian crisis. That framing mattered because it kept the problem contained. A crisis described as internal can be managed with sanctions, statements, and distance. What changed was the realization that the consequences were no longer staying inside national borders. Historical patterns show that external attention sharpens when instability begins to spill outward. Venezuela's prolonged breakdown reshaped migration flows across Latin America, strained neighboring governments, and complicated regional security planning. According to regional assessments, what once appeared to be a domestic failure began to register as a persistent source of unpredictability. That shift is significant because policymakers are trained to respond very differently to instability they believe cannot be contained. At the same time, Venezuela's strategic value never disappeared. It simply went dormant. The country holds vast reserves of oil and other resources that, under stable conditions, would place it among the most influential energy producers in the world. Analysts emphasize that resources do not need to be actively exploited to matter. The possibility that they could re-enter global markets during periods of supply stress is often enough to alter how major powers calculate risk. This is where the story moves beyond surface explanations. Energy politics today are shaped less by abundance than by reliability. Historical data shows that when supply chains grow fragile, governments prioritize control and predictability over ideology. Venezuela's position, combined with weakened institutions, created a contradiction: enormous potential paired with limited capacity to manage it. That gap is where outside interest tends to intensify. From Washington's perspective, official statements have increasingly presented Venezuela as a convergence of concerns rather than a single problem. US officials cite allegations involving organized crime, democratic erosion, and foreign partnerships that complicate regional balance. Each claim has surfaced separately over time, but together they form a framework that recasts Venezuela from a humanitarian issue into a strategic one. Analysts note that this shift in classification matters more than any individual accusation. Timing also plays a decisive role. US foreign policy history suggests that escalation often coincides with moments when decision-makers believe delay will produce worse outcomes. This calculation does not require certainty, only a belief that options are narrowing. In that context, Venezuela becomes more than a policy challenge. It becomes a signal watched closely by allies and rivals who are assessing credibility, resolve, and precedent. Across Latin America, the situation is viewed through a different lens. Many governments have criticized Venezuela's leadership, yet they remain wary of external intervention. Diplomatic responses emphasize restraint and sovereignty, reflecting a collective memory shaped by past involvement from powerful neighbors. Regional analysts stress that this caution is not ideological loyalty, but learned skepticism rooted in experiences where intervention promised stability and delivered prolonged disruption. This divergence in interpretation is central to why the current moment feels unstable. Where Washington emphasizes containment and security, much of the region hears echoes of earlier eras. Where US officials describe necessity, Latin American leaders calculate precedent. These perspectives coexist uneasily, and history suggests that such gaps in perception tend to widen under pressure rather than narrow. Global power competition adds another layer that rarely appears in brief coverage. Venezuela's relationships with countries outside the US-led order have expanded gradually rather than dramatically. Analysts note that even limited cooperation can alter strategic equations when it introduces uncertainty into regions long considered predictable. Influence does not need to be decisive to be disruptive. It only needs to complicate planning. Reducing this situation to a single motive oversimplifies the reality. It is not only about oil, and it is not only about narcotics allegations. Records and expert assessments suggest these elements function as tools within a broader context over leverage. Control over future options, alignment, and regional norms often matters more than immediate outcomes. The human cost, however, is far less abstract. Historical evidence shows that civilian populations absorb the consequences of escalation long before institutions do. Economic instability, displacement, and prolonged uncertainty tend to follow periods of heightened pressure, even when initial actions are described as limited. Analysts who study intervention patterns warn that carefully calibrated moves can still reshape internal politics in ways that make recovery harder, not easier. If the current trajectory continues, several paths remain possible. One leads toward managed de-escalation, where pressure gives way to negotiation and partial compromise. Another extends into prolonged standoff, hardening positions and shrinking diplomatic space. The most dangerous path involves misinterpretation, where actions intended as signals are received as threats, triggering responses no one originally intended. What makes this moment significant is not the visible event itself, but the alignment of conditions behind it. Years of unresolved conflict, shifting energy priorities, regional strain, and global competition converged at the same time. Analysts note that such convergence is rare, and when it occurs, it tends to redefine what follows. The unresolved question is not whether something larger sits behind the Venezuela crisis. The question is whether the forces that made this moment unavoidable are now strong enough to shape what comes next. That answer will not arrive with the next headline, but with the decisions made after attention begins to move elsewhere.